Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where I talk about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Doom Patrol, which is basically the pseudo season finale. It's a whole thing just because of production-wise. The season wasn't as long as they wanted it to be. I think it was supposed to be like at least, from what I was reading a little bit, it seems like it was supposed to be at least one episode longer, so a full 10. But regardless of all that, I'm still going to, break down my thoughts about the episode. I thought it was actually a great episode because it sets up a lot of really interesting things. Well, first and foremost, we kind of get a peek into her life. I kind of figured it's me skipping around a little bit, but I figured Jane's story, Kay's story this episode was going to be about the birth of Jane because it's like 1969. So I'm like, okay, we know because of season one that she existed personality wise when she was in the 70s, because that's when Jane got locked up and stuff like that before the experiments and everything, before she ended up getting her superpowers and everything. We knew Jane existed. So I'm like, we know that you're still Miranda. So Jane hasn't come about but yet. So I'm like, this must be things that eventually lead to how Jane got born. It's so interesting to know. I guess Jane, because Jane only feels like she learned about Miranda last season. So, I mean, and it makes sense. Miranda wasn't around. Like, the moment, Miranda tossed herself into the well, Jane was born. So, it's like they needed a new primary to kind of fill that role because, it's pseudo... Miranda failed. Well, actually, I'll jump quickly into it since I'm already here. The fact of the matter is, it's like obviously considering her upbringing and everything associated with her father, Miranda was very kind of timid and obviously getting close to people, probably especially men, probably wasn't the easiest thing for her. Because once again, I still hang on to that line from Jane being like, Baby Doll is literally the only one that was okay with men. Like every other personality had their issues just because it all came about because of the trauma that Kay went through, So obviously that kind of distrust of men kind of, radiated amongst the other personalities. Once again, rightfully so, you can understand why. But basically she got close to this dude and eventually they move in together and stuff. But he's obviously saying you can tell it's a little bit of a thing where she kind of wants to take things at her own paces, and he talks about the fact is that he's like, yeah, I realize you have the most upbringing, but the fact of the matter is it's like, because she's a little hesitant, because she's like, if I need to do something, I need to talk it out, because she's talking to Kay. I don't think the other personalities were necessarily born at that, when she, I think at the time, she was the only one that existed. But then after everything went down, the others were born. We'll get to that in a second. But it's not until, they get to the party and everything, and it's like, whoa, your coworker Bob kissed me. It's like, oh yeah, come on, lighten up. And I'm like, all right, this is the 70s. Oh, it's super hippie. It's just all about free love, man. And I'm like, but it's not free love in this particular case, because she says she's not really sure about it. And he's basically giving her an ultimatum. It's like, oh, we're just basically in two different parts of our lives and stuff like that. So it's kind of making her feel like, oh, if you want us to continue, you kind of have to do this. So he's pressuring her into, she's like, no, oh, okay. He's like, they almost like, oh, thanks, babe. And she's looking in the mirror, she's talking to Kay, like, thank you for being okay with this. This is our way to step forward, because obviously they've always just kind of taken, baby steps just because, trying to ease Kay back into a life outside of that whole situation back at home. And, because Miranda does strongly believe I know what's best for you. I've always known what's best for you. So it's okay. I know what's best for us. So turns into a full-blown swinger orgy type of swinger party, but it's because I feel like orgies usually involve everyone banging to all at once, but it's they were, but it's they were separately banging. I just assume everyone on top of each other, touching and banging each other in that moment. But it's no, they're just kind of sectioned off banging. That's why I'm I guess that still technically counts as an orgy. I've never actually looked up the proper definition of what an orgy is. I just have my preconceived notions of what one is. Regardless. But in that moment, and it was interesting because you saw the birth of her person. The moment she started stuttering, I was like, Penny. And then the moment she was like, get off me, I was like, oh, that's super hammerhead. No doubts about that. But then in that moment, she ended up passing out. And then Miranda wakes up and she sees Hammerhead. And it's she sees Driver 8. I'm assuming the one that was really getting into it, I'm assuming that's supposed to be Scarlet Harlot. Maybe, like I said, that's just a preconceived notion of mine. But then basically the secretary goes over. It's you were supposed to look out for what's best for the girl. And obviously, Miranda goes to Kay, and Kay's not talking to her. She closes the door on her. She's like, I'm sorry, I thought this was a step forward for us. but because I think at that moment and how that could be perceived as like, you put us in a dangerous position. You made us, kind of, we might have been making progress. We definitely took like 5 steps back because of you. Because it's like, was this really about what was best for Kay, or was it just because you loved your boyfriend so much that you were kind of like almost pushing Kay's issues aside to be like, no, this is what's best for us, even though it's more like, no, this is what I want, So, each one of the personalities kind of want what they want, but at the core of everything, it's supposed to be all about Kay. So that's a whole thing. And I was like, that's so fascinating. And like I said, it finally makes us understand like how Miranda got to that situation where she threw herself in the well because she felt like, I failed Kay. Like, I don't know whether she was trying to kill herself or whether she thought she would grow from the situation, but and then when she wakes up, it's like the moment she starts talking to all of them, basically kind of reveling it up, being like, oh, these guys, this isn't about love. You guys don't know the first thing about love. This is about control. She's like, you didn't do this because you wanted to make things better between us. You wanted this because you wanted new pussy. And it's like, being blunt like that, you're like, oh, that's super Jane. And it's just like punches him in the face and stuff like that. He's like, oh, you need help and stuff like that. And she's like, my name's Miranda. I'm Jane. It's like, it's so interesting. We finally get Jane's origin story because we've gotten Miranda's now. Now we've gotten, Jane's. And I think it's so fascinating in the long run. And I think maybe that's why Kay has responded the way she has to Jane. And once again, that's always what I've talked about. Like I talked about previously, like I feel like Miranda did what she thought Kay wanted. I feel like Jane represents what Kay needs. That's what I feel like, but because, and because she has kind of responded to Jane in a way I feel like she never really responded to the others. I think she was willing to give Miranda another shot because Miranda had always been that, but it's like, oh, now it seems like you are doing what I need you to. And the moment she gets into, like, Jane's still in the well, she sees the necklace and she's pulling it. I was like, Miranda's dead, isn't she? And lo and behold, it's true. I was like, she's been dead the entire time. I was like, who the fuck is that? I was like, is it going to be Candlemaker or something? I was like, no. And then it's like, oh, sweet baby. I'm like, it's her dad. Like that the darkness that was her dad and the trauma he inflicted on her literally manifested itself inside of her. So it's like he's still alive to a certain extent. And so, because that's what I was wondering. I kept being like, why is she trying to dismantle everything that is Kay's, like protection? Like, making all these excuses while you're actually dumping them in the well. I was like, I didn't understand. Now I was like, are you trying to, like, what are you getting from this? Like, because what does that trauma, it's like, you're like, it wants to hurt her because it's like it's a manifestation of the disgusting perversions of her dad, and so it's what does it want to do? And when it gets to Kay, what it needs to do is get rid of the goddamn bodyguards, all those other personalities or bodyguards. It's like we need to remove them completely and now leave Kay in a vulnerable position because that thing's her dad, for lack of a better term, broke her. It destroyed her. And, it took her other personalities kind of trying, like, holding her together. And it's like he's trying to break apart that foundation that's been built up over these decades. And so, because it exists to basically destroy Kay. Like I said, it's built, it's the darkness that exists in her from her dad, like the trauma and the terrible things her dad did to her, like that darkness manifesting itself. It's kind of driven off the fact of like, oh, this is what your dad would want. It's essentially her dad, manifested inside of, so I thought that was such an interesting, like, reveal, and especially the way they went about it, because I was like, like I said, the entire time I was trying to find out what Miranda's whole deal was. I was like, why do you feel like you're dismantling it? And it makes perfect sense now, you not being Miranda. Miranda never came out that well. She died. Like, whether it was like she died because she killed herself, which is like, once again, it still comes to that conversation, like, we can die, right? And even Jada brought it up, can they come back? So it's like, could Miranda be revitalized? Or did she just straight up die from going in the well? Or was it specifically this thing that killed her? I think it's interesting that it chose now of any time, but I think it's because Jane was in a free fall ever since last season. It put Kay in a position, once again, they said it, they're like, you're making Kay vulnerable, and she left the door cracked open enough for this thing that slipped through, pretend to be Miranda and everything. So now it's led to this situation. I was like, that's such a fascinating turn on that story I thought was kind of interesting. At the same time, this is all going down. Cliff's excited because it's like, oh man, I get to go to my daughter's wedding. Now he's trying to pick out something to wear. It's kind of like, well, they're not going to be staring too much at the bride, robot dad and everything. He's like, wait, who are you? Where's Jane? It's like, and it was also sweet because he's like, oh, these shirts, they're Jane's. Jane picked them out for me and stuff like that. But it's like, oh, Miranda picked out one. It was like, oh, interruption was written on the shirt. He's like, oh, that's good. Oh, Miranda's actually pretty awesome and everything. So that was pretty dope. And I love Rita kind of picking up Vic. Vic's like playing out like a heartbroken song, because he's heartbroken about everything. And it's just kind of like, and Rita's like, oh, when I was your age, I've literally had my heart broken like 16 times or something like that by the time I was your age. And it's just kind of like, she's like, you felt bad because of the whole Ronnie thing. She's like, I feel bad because she was right in front of me and I didn't do anything. I could have stopped her, but I didn't. So it's kind of like, all right, Cliff is about to go to his daughter's wedding. We got to show up. Say goodbye, but as Cliff was about to leave, one of the spider imaginary friend of Dorothy's is like, yo, shit's going down, and Larry's the one that's like, all right guys, let's get together. And they're like, he's almost like, what, I can't be the one kind of leading the team in the operation. So everyone's kind of going, and Cliff's like, well, I'm gonna go to my daughter's wedding. It's like, no, did you not hear that? Dorothy's in trouble. He's like, yeah, but it's like, the chief situation is a byproduct of his fuck-ups. I've got to fix my fuck-ups. Like, especially if the world is ending, I want to be there, spend that time with my daughter. It's like, well, you won't have that time to be there with her if the world's ending, so that's a bit of a catch-22 in that regard. But it's kind of a thing of, like, you want to be a better person for your daughter. Like, this would be, like, saving this little girl would be a proof of, like, the fact is, so he has to kind of leave a message, which we still never found out whether or not Clara had heard the previous voice message he had left on the voicemail or answering machine. So, and I just love, what was it he said about himself? He's like, oh, because like he falls back and he has his phone on his chest. He's like, oh, I'm such a loser. It's almost like a guy that was like left an embarrassing message for the girl he's in love with. It's almost that. It's almost like that's such a like teen drama-y like thing to do. I don't mean that just like television. I mean like that's just like a teen thing of just like, oh, I'm such a loser. Oh, that was so stupid. Like you're beating yourself up about it. It seemed interesting that him be in that position. But luckily they all show up where Dorothy was, and obviously the place is covered in wax. We never actually got to see what happened to the other people, like whether they managed to get out of there in time. Because like the only people you later on see is wax, is the characters. You never see anyone outside of them. But slowly but surely they end up being in a position where they or have to split up. I could even love Cliff and be like, what the fuck is going on? He's like, I can't believe I'm agreeing with Cliff. And Larry's like, but what the fuck is going on? They see Kip is there, and he ends up getting dragged away because it's like, oh, we're not being attacked by her imaginary friends. We're being attacked by our own imaginary friends. He gets dragged away by his, and like Rita's calling him out for his imaginary friend. He's like, it was a 15th century, literally didn't have anything else. And he gets dragged away. And they split up. And Larry's like, yeah, I don't think I had an imaginary friend. And Cliff is like, that's the saddest thing I've ever heard. And as they're splitting and going different paths. And it's interesting when you break down everyone's imaginary friends. Rita's was really interesting because basically hers an amalgamation of all these beautiful aspects about when, like, who she wanted to be. Kind of like, I think the kind of ideal person of like, yeah, she even talked about it, like the eyes she cut out for this imaginary friend. Because it's like, oh, magazine pictures she put together, like for example the eyes were her mom's eyes, and it's like, oh, like this friend is there, she's tap dancing and stuff like that, kind of helping her. It's kind of like, oh, I was your friend until you kind of abandoned me. It's like the moment you got your first role, you abandoned me. It's like, no, it wasn't necessarily because of you. It's because obviously she remembers like her mom, like, having sex with the producer to get her that role, and obviously that kind of created like the kind of confidence issue that Rita has, and kind of like the psychological block is kind of created in her mind because of it. But she didn't talk about the fact is the reason why she left her imaginary friend behind is because those were her mom's eyes. She thought her mom had the most beautiful eyes, but it's like after that situation, she couldn't look her mom in the eyes anymore. Definitely can't look in your imaginary friend who's literally got cut out versions of your mom's eyes. So it's like, there's that. There's Vic. I thought was interesting where his was literally an imagined Dr. Cowboy who was basically like, I'm sure for him it's like his dad was, it's supposed to be a version of his dad that's everything that his dad isn't. You know, it's probably like a little more fun, and even Dr. Cowboy talks about it, like, oh, I'm supposed to be kind of basically your yes man. I'm supposed to reinforce what you believe. You know, your dad, he's the one that, you know, gives you the actual advice and stuff like that. He might be strict and all that, but that's him. Me, I'm supposed to be kind of the fun guy that kind of just goes along with whatever you feel. It's like, oh, if you feel like you did the right thing, trust your gut. Like, oh, let Ronnie go. Oh, it was okay. It's like, even though you severely fucked up by doing that, because it's like, because he's trying to justify it by being like, after what that group did to Ronnie, like maybe her killing them is kind of like the right thing. It's like, oh yeah, if you believe in your gut that it was the right thing to do, but it's like, no, you're just kind of, it's basically his conscience, his subconscious being like, oh yeah, I'm literally just a manifestation telling you exactly what you want to hear, reinforcing what you believe, you know. Cliff's ended up being interesting. I was like, what's his going to be? Oh, it's literally Jesus. And Cliff is like, Jesus? And Jesus proceeds to kick his ass, breaking one of his eyes, ripping his arm off. I was like, yo, Jesus is going hard on his ass. And it's like, because it's like, oh, you abandoned me. He's like, you're my imaginary friend. You were literally my friend for like half a day at Bible camp. It's like, what is this? Jesus laying down a smackdown on him. But then it becomes like, okay, when you really break his situation down, it's like, oh, like Jesus is kind of his good friend, because it's like his dad at the time, him and his mom were splitting up at like, you know, for the millionth time. And it's like, he believed his dad when it's like, oh, things would be better. Things would be different. But even Cliff recognizes like, oh, like, it's like he knew that it was never, like, no matter what, that his dad wasn't going to, like, things weren't going to be different. He knew they weren't, but he was like 7 years old, so he needed to believe it, you know? And so, for one, it's like, well, Jesus, you understand. You had, and you know, that's probably why he chose to latch on to Jesus, because, like, oh, you know what it's like to have dad issues. And, you know, now the cycle's repeating itself, because he's like, I literally did the same thing to Clara. I'm still doing the same thing to Clara. And Jesus is like, oh man, he's like, Jesus. And he's like, are you allowed to, you know, kind of say your name in blasphemy almost like that? It's kind of like, I think, you know, Jesus gets a slide on that, which is so interesting in the grand scheme of things, because, you know, this is me kind of just thinking about it in the grand scheme of things. I just think it's funny because this is DC, you know, this whole thing with, like, it's an imaginary Jesus, but it just makes me think, because Preacher was under Vertigo, which is under the DC umbrella. Wasn't that a whole, like, I'm probably, like, I remember, like, Vertigo was supposed to be going away, like, the comic book company Vertigo, like, it's supposed to be going away. I think it's just all going to be, like, 100% DC going forward. I don't know if there's, like, other sub companies underneath DC like Vertigo was. I don't know if there's any others like that. I'm not, once again, not well versed in all this, but regardless, it just immediately made me think about that, just because it's just like DC's interesting relationship with, you know, granted, I mean, that's not DC, that's more so about the people who make, you know, in that particular case, like, you know, Garth Ennis and everything. Regardless, I'm going in tangents and stuff like that. But it's like, okay, good. It's all fine and dandy. It's like, oh, it looks like, you know, Vic's kind of confronting his issues. Cliff is, you know, hugging it out with Jesus, but then it proceeds to be like, oh no, like, it's Candlemaker kind of luring you into a false sense of security, and then bam, hit you with your insecurities. Because the interesting thing was, like, because Larry literally said, I don't have an imaginary friend, he saw Kip and then he ended up getting frozen. So I think if it's like a thing of like, oh, you have no one I can mess with, you already have your issues, you're still living with them. Like, that stuff with his parents his son and his grandson and great grandson, like, all that's fresh enough where it's like, oh, you're literally still carrying that around. I don't need to use your imaginary friend to kind of break you down. It's like, oh, you're already broken down enough that all I got to do is candle wax you. And then he proceeds to candle wax everyone. Cliff got it the hardest, dude. Cliff literally got exploded into pieces and then waxed. And it was like, yo. And even at the same time, like, everything going on with Miranda, because, like, even in her state, you know, Kay's body ends up getting waxed. And I thought it was so interesting. That sounds so much dirtier than I meant it to be, because I just had to stop. I was like, oh yeah, there's a huge innuendo right there. Regardless, the fact of the matter is, when it was all said and done, though, it's because it's like, oh, they pulled Miranda back because they were like, yeah, like, where is Jane? Where are the others? But she's like, oh, do you know what Kay wants? I do. And that's where I was kind of starting to get like, especially because Kay was kind of wandering off, probably looking for Jane too, and ended up finding Jane's station closed. So there's all of that. But at the same time, there's the whole situation with Dorothy. Like, her dad is there. Now, the thing is the syringe she had, is that for him, or is that meant to be for Dorothy? Like, I think maybe the thing was get her close enough, knock her out, and then, like, maybe this could all slow down. but her mom comes to her because he's telling her to close her eyes and come to him, but like she saw what happened to everybody. Obviously Cliff is the one that kind of devastated her the most because, you know, she spent time with Cliff. He's the one that kind of, you know, convinced her to leave the moon and everything. So it's like, look what I did. And so for him, he was trying to tell her to come here, like, you know, but it's like, because her mom shows up and is like, basically, it's up to you. You have to kind of rise to adulthood. You're old enough now. You have to be the one to end up defeating Candlemaker, this curse that's kind of been passed down our people and everything. Obviously, you know, for him, it's like, because that she will always be his, you know, essentially his baby girl. And it's like, look what happened to everyone else. This is too much for her to handle. She's a little girl, but she's like, I know what I need to do. She puts on the boots, you know, because it's like she's the only one that can potentially stop this. So her mom is like, oh, you need a weapon. She's like, no, I can make one. And she's kind of readied up. And Candlemaker, it's like, oh, basically like it's time, because I think the moment he's able to fully assimilate her into him, he's 100% free. He doesn't have to worry about being bound to her anymore. So that's where the episode ends. Like I brought up earlier, this is like a pseudo season finale, just because like there was supposed to be like a 10th episode supposedly. So at the time of me recording this, there hasn't been announced whether or not there is going to be a third season, whether this is going to get renewed or not. Let's not also forget there's a whole complicated DC Universe situation, so this might, obviously going forward, it probably would stay more an HBO Max situation if that ended up being the case. Just because, I mean, even like I think the whole Stargirl situation being more of a CW thing, I don't think it's going to be on the DC Universe app coinciding like at all in the second season. Regardless, a lot of that's like, well, for one, productions are shut down and stuff like that. So obviously there's still a lot of that. So I'm curious to see, because I'm assuming like production wise they never even got to the 10th episode. So they're just saying like it was supposed to be 10 episodes. So that's why I'm thinking like this is more so a season finale, because I don't know if they're going to do a thing of like kind of like The Walking Dead where it's like, oh, and the season finale is going to come out later this year or later next year, whatever they're able to kind of pick up production. It's probably just going to be like, and this is just going to be a 9-episode season, and this pick up right here with season. I mean, because if I'm not mistaken, like someone had tried to explain it to me, Titan season 1 that's why Titan season 1 kind of ends off on the weird place it does, and season 2 kind of begins at the weird place it was, because the season was split the way it was. So technically that should have been like episode 12 of season 1 should have been episode 12 of season 1 should have been episode 1 of season 2. Regardless, I think it might be a situation like that. So we might be kind of like a season 1 Titans type of situation with this. I don't know. Hopefully this gets brought back for Thursday, because I'd love to see, like, because we're left it up in the air, like, where the hell are we going with this? Like, you know, is things going to work out for Dorothy? What about Jane? Jane's probably going to try and fight her way back to the top, because she's probably, like, the only other personality that can do this. She's the primary, and, like, you know, it's probably up there, because I actually expected her to kind of pop up and save the day type of situation. Like, when she was going towards the light, I thought it was going to be her breaking free and kicking some ass type of situation. Like, I mean, it still doesn't mean it won't happen. But, I mean, literally, this is like everyone's loot lost. Like, everyone's, like, turned the wax, you know? So, obviously, what Niles is end up going to doing, like, I mean, he's probably just going to have to wait for things between Candlemaker and Dorothy to kind of get settled. But beyond that, like, you know, how this whole thing plays out. I hopefully the show does get a third season, because I'd love to see ultimately where all of this would end up taking us going forward. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, love life to the fullest, enjoy it, good day, and goodbye.